I'd like to welcome everybody today to our next speaker in the Zoom series for the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome. It's my great pleasure to introduce Catherine Smith. Catherine is Secretary of the CACOR in Canada, and I had the pleasure of having a discussion with her about a year ago. When I heard what her expertise was, I thought, oh, she'd be a fantastic speaker. So we've got her today to give us a talk. What she told me that day was that she was a paleoanthropologist who specialized in climate change, human diet, and how those two interacted to affect the evolution of humans. So, and currently she is working on looking at the current climate change issues and what's going to happen with people and how things are going there. So it's with she's worked in the United States as a university professor, and she has worked all around the world looking at various aspects of human evolution. So with that, Catherine, I'm really looking forward to today's presentation, and I hope we have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean, for that introduction. Yes, if you were expecting that past, present, and future in looking at food security was going to be maybe a couple of 100 years, you might want to leave the meeting now, because I actually plan on going back and sort of taking a very wide angle lens to this question and look from about 4 to 6 million years ago to the present to really set food security for today in a context of where we have come from, what has shaped our bodies over that time, and therefore what that means for how we're living our lives today and how we will in the future. Let's begin with just a few definitions so that we're all on the same page. And I want to start by just defining for you food security itself. Food security, of course, exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Conversely, therefore, food insecurity is that situation that exists when people lack secure access to sufficient amounts of safe and nutritious food, the food that's needed to grow normally and develop healthily and have an active and healthy lifestyle. So what I'm going to do is get you to think about those definitions as we now turn our attention to the past. So I'm going to begin by telling you that many, if not most, of the important evolutionary adaptations in our lineage, humans, both physical and cultural, were driven by climate change. And in fact, the need for our ancestors to maintain adequate food resources, but food resources in the face of a changing environment. So I'm going to first explore with you a bit about how access to food shaped our evolutionary history, in particular our bodies, but as well as our minds and cultural settings over the past 4 million to 6 million years. With that knowledge behind us then, we'll look at the way food security exists and does not exist in our situations today, and then look at what this might mean, both in terms of the access to food as well as our biological makeup for what might be in store for us in the future. I want to start by just emphasizing again that our story and the story of our food security as well as our evolutionary history is very intimately connected or linked with climate change. This graph, by the way, time kind of runs in the wrong direction, so I put then and now here at the top. But I'm going to focus again on this period from 6 million years to the present. And what I really don't want you to worry about any of the details in this graph, but I just want you to notice a couple of things. One, these little colored bars represent different lineages in our family tree, the hominins, which go back, as I said, about 6 million years. I'm going to focus mostly on these here. Notice that some of them overlap in time, so there was more than one species or lineage around at the same time. But most importantly of all, I want you to look at the blue squiggly line in the middle. This is an oxygen isotope curve. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. But what you can see, anyone can see, is that the squiggles are getting much more pronounced as time goes on. And also there's a trend towards cooling temperatures. Now our lineage evolved in Africa, And in Africa, that means an increasingly seasonal environment. But it also means an environment that's becoming ever more fluctuating and less predictable. So environments were becoming uncertain, which meant that food resources were doing the same. So now let's turn to one of the first transitions in our lineage that really began to shape who we are today. And that is walking on two legs, or bipedalism. Surprisingly, this actually we think happened somewhere between 4 and 6 million years ago, but in woodland or forest areas of Africa. And here's a reconstruction of one species, Ardipithecus, which is already adopting bipedalism, or walking on two legs, at least some of the time. Now, why would these organisms have done this, and what would have the advantages have been? Well, first of all, it appears to be an advantageous feeding posture. In other words, the ability to be able to reach for fruits, which would otherwise have been inaccessible, maybe even to walk along thick branches, and also to walk along on the ground from food patch to food patch may have been really beneficial. Finally, we think that even wading in shallow waters to get at nutritious roots and tubers, as well as frogs, eggs of animals, fish, shellfish, little crustaceans, things like that, would all have made wonderful food resources, all better accessed by walking on two legs rather than four. Now, I want to stress that as the environment began to get more seasonal, it was probably true that food patches became more widely spaced out. And that means that the more efficiently you can get from food A to food B, the better off you're going to be. And it turns out that lots of energetic studies have been done that show that, believe it or not, walking on two legs, as difficult as it is for some of us sometimes, is actually more energetically efficient than walking on all fours. And so this, in our lineage at least, so this was something that we now understand would have been a real benefit. Finally, a sort of tangential benefit of walking on two legs would have been the ability to be able to carry some foods, maybe for later consumption, maybe to share with dependent offspring, maybe to just get away from a predator and eat it in a place that was more safe. So this particular transition was, we believe, the first significant one, very intimately linked to diet. And these individuals, you can probably imagine them like chimpanzees, relying a lot on forest fruits and foliage, with brains the size of a chimpanzee, but they're walking on two legs. Just a little note here about wading at water's edge. This is not an aquatic hypothesis particularly, but if the environment was getting drier, going down to where water was still available would not have only provided water for drinking, but also, as I mentioned, for water's edge plants, as you can see being consumed here, as well as fish, frogs, snails, and all sorts of other animals. Now, as the environment continued to get dry, as I mentioned before, this may have been very beneficial to walk on two legs, as you had to move from one maybe source of fruit in the trees over a more open area to another source of fruits. I have a little side story, is that our lineage actually contains a branch which I would call cousins. They aren't in our direct line, but they are a hominin and they are closely related to us. These are the robust Australopithecines, or paranthropines. And interestingly, this particular lineage solved, quote unquote, the biological problem of a drying and ever increasingly seasonal environment by actually using tough, fibrous roots and tubers. Now, these weren't favored foods. They would have eaten them during the lean seasons. But what we've discovered is that this lineage actually evolved massive chewing apparatus and molar teeth. Their brains stayed really quite small, but man, do they have big chompers. Now, again, I want to stress the concept of a fallback food. These are not favored foods, but they were so important to the survival of getting from one good season to the next that they actually shaped our evolutionary adaptations, such that in this particular lineage, big teeth come into play. Just to compare, I thought just for fun, obviously on the right here, we have a modern human skull, upper mandible and skull. And down here, here we have that of a robust Australopithecine. You can see that the molar teeth are about 4 times the size of ours today. Great big teeth, little tiny brains. It was one strategy, and it was very successful for millions of years. But it wasn't our strategy. At the same time and on the same landscape, we actually had another group of early hominins who were dealing with this ever increasingly dry habitat in a very different way. During those lean seasons that I was just talking about, these individuals turned more to animal foods. In particular, we think they were scavenging on large carcasses left behind by other high-level carnivores, and they were also probably hunting small game and gathering even smaller game than that. But with these large animals, here we're seeing a group members here processing a carcass, but they're doing so using stone tools. This is the time when stone tools begin to appear in the archaeological record. This is really, really critical because it allowed them to have access to these resources in a way that was not previously available. So in this case, meat and marrow, rather than tough roots and tubers, were a strategy. They were a fallback food, at least initially. But again, they were so important to the survival of this particular group that they influenced their bodies and brains. And in fact, this is the advent of our own genus, the genus Homo. And we're now emphasizing some meat eating, an expanded brain, but certainly not big teeth anymore. That it doesn't seem to be necessary. Why not necessary? Well, meat and marrow, as we've seen from large animals, are best extracted when you use stone tools, just to pound open a bone, but a sharp flake to cut off meat and tendon. That would be what the key point being that they are very nutritionally rich foods. Difficult to get to, but once you can get to them, they provide a lot of bang for the buck. Now we think that this is the time that actually allowed brains to begin to get a little bit bigger. And I say allowed very intentionally, because it turns out that brains are extremely expensive organs to grow and to maintain. They don't make up very much of the weight of our bodies, but they take up over 25% of the calories that we consume. Now, this also probably allowed teeth to get smaller, especially if we were using tools. First of all, meat and marrow are not difficult to chew. Second of all, if you're using tools, you don't have to use your body to be able to get access to the food. So this set us on a trajectory in which early humans began using their environment very, very differently as they traveled much farther for access to carcasses, to begin systematic hunting, to go to water's edge and use a variety of resources that might have been available there. And we really begin to see a shift in what parts of the anatomy are being emphasized. So we've looked at this time period now with the origins of our genus. We looked at the paranthropines and their giant teeth. And now we're going to continue on in our lineage, Homo, with a couple of other really key adaptations that are again shaped by diet and climate. One I want to point out is you'll notice that at this time here, the amplitude of these wiggles is getting ever more extreme. And we think that this was important because it meant that behavioral flexibility and adaptability were key, especially when the environment was becoming less predictable. Also, we think this may have been the time when our early ancestors began to move out of Africa and populate the rest of the old world, probably in search of food. And thirdly, we're going to look at another transition, that of using fire and cooking next, and see what the implications of that might have been. We don't know exactly when fire was controlled in a systematic way, because the archaeological evidence is hard to distinguish in this respect. It may have been as long as 1.5 million years ago. Others argue that it might only have been 800,000 years ago or even more recently. But apart from being useful for protection from predators, warmth, in colder settings, the really key aspect for our purposes today is that the controlled use of fire allowed for cooking. Now, you may be thinking about cooking like this picture here on the top left, which I think is really amusing and stereotypical. It looks like two early hominins having a weenie roast, showing them maybe roasting some meat over the fire. And while that may have been true and that may have happened, I just want to stress that meat doesn't really benefit from being cooked. It's not more nutritious, nor is it easier to chew. Yes, it may reduce the bacterial load, but our ancestors had a gut that was probably a lot tougher than ours. However, on the flip side, if you began roasting nuts and underground storage organs like tubers and roots and things like this, you would greatly increase the nutrient and caloric availability of these foods. They're not only do they have more calories available, but they're actually easier to chew. So I want to stress the fact that increasing dietary quality, both in terms of meat, which may have come a little bit earlier, and in terms of cooking with respect to vegetable foods, may have set us up for yet another transition linked to diet in our biology, and that is our even more massive brains. When I was telling you that the brains began to expand around the time of early Homo, we were going from a brain size capacity of maybe 400 or 500 cubic centimeters up to 600 cubic centimeters with Homo habilis. Here, time is going on the x-axis in the right direction, and on the y-axis, we have the size of the brain. But in the time period where cooking comes in, you can see that things skyrocket, such that by today, Homo sapiens cranial capacity is probably on average around 1,500 cubic centimeters. It tripled. What allowed this to happen? Well, previous hypotheses, as we've just talked about, include improving our dietary quality by the use of animal foods, which are rich in both the protein and in particular the fatty acids that are required to grow and maintain a brain. But we've just been looking at cooking as well as being a critical variable. And cooking of starchy tubers in particular may have really added that extra piece that was necessary for brain size to take off. Organisms don't grow big brains unless they can be really sure that they're going to have adequate calories as well as adequate protein and polyunsaturated fatty acids to grow that brain in the first place. Little aside, we're an unusual species in that we do a lot of our brain growth after we're born rather than in the womb. So if we're going to summarize what we've seen so far about the past, what we've learned is that environmental change has really forced our ancestors in different lineages, in different ways at different times, to adapt, both biologically and then subsequently behaviorally. But time and time again, this has happened. Always the goal was the same: to maintain an adequate and predictable diet in the face of a more unpredictable climate. And in our particular lineage, the genus Homo, the result was actually an increase in dietary quality, where we saw ever more nutrient-dense foods being consumed. This might have meant animal resources from water's edge, from scavenging, from hunting. But it may also have meant cooking tubers, roots, and nuts to increase their availability. And as we just saw, that would have allowed for a massive increase in brain size. Note that as time goes on in this graph and in this story, technological advances really become more and more important. Our ancestors begin using cultural characteristics and behavioral traits to solve their evolutionary and biological challenges related to diet, rather than simply relying on natural selection to quote unquote do the work for them. Before we move on to the next slide, I do want you to remember that at this time and up until this point, our ancestors were hunters and gatherers, as we often say. Now, whether you emphasize the hunting side or the gathering side will depend on where you live in time and place. But this is the backdrop against which the final transition that we're going to talk about takes place. And that is agriculture. You'll notice I said the present agriculture, and then I said roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. Well, when you're a paleoanthropologist, that's the present, because we go back millions of years. Anyway, at the end of the Ice Age, which happened about 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans began domesticating plants and animals, and they did this in various parts of the world almost at the same time. Even though the crops were different and the animals were different in each setting, it seemed to happen rather rapidly from place to place. To me, and to many others, that suggests that climate was once again playing an influence in why we would have changed the way we get our food and what food we consume. So many theories abound as to why agriculture appeared, but certainly climate change at the end of the Ice Age is a big one. In this case, though, the end of the Ice Age may have actually brought warmer and slightly more predictable climates to the landscape, and that may have actually allowed agriculture to proceed. In addition, for the first time in our evolutionary history, population pressure may have exerted a bit of a force. There's probably about 1 million to 5 million people on the planet at this point, and they're all living in the old world. The new world has not yet been populated. But as the best places to hunt and gather are no longer available, there may have been competition for food resources between groups. Likewise, there might not have been anywhere better to move to if your crops were, if the foods in your environment were now depleted, or if something happened, the strategy in the past might have been to move. Maybe that was no longer possible. Likewise, with more people, social pressures may have influenced availability to food and even who wanted food and who had to provide it. Now, once agriculture got into the swing of things and really got going, it's often said to be one of the most incredible adaptations of human beings. However, I would like to argue that agriculture is a mixed blessing. I'm going to start with the really good, then I'm going to get into the not so good, and then I'm going to get into the really bad and the ugly. But let's start with the good. The benefits of agriculture are very numerous. First of all, really obviously to everybody, more people can be fed on a given unit of arable land or any kind of land. This has greatly increased productivity. Second, the kinds of foods that were domesticated, usually staple grains and tubers, were very rich in calories. And so this provided a lot of food and some predictability. So I've said the food base is more predictable, but I've also said in brackets, is it? And I'll return to that question in a minute, because the answer is yes, sometimes, but no, not other times. Now, people can settle down too. In fact, they often need to in order to keep an eye on their crops and tend to them. They don't need to move seasonally from one food that's available to another, as we saw our ancestors did in the past. And this actually allowed them to create more substantial dwellings and even institute ways to store food so that your food can be even more predictable if you've saved some up for another time. These starchy staples I talked about are actually good for weaning babies. And we see at the time of the origins of agriculture all around the old world that population size increases and the number of offspring, therefore, per individual was probably increasing. You got a better weaning food available. I'll qualify that in a minute, however. Now, I said I was going to turn to the not so good size. Yes, agriculture has its curses too. In fact, some researchers have argued not that it was the greatest thing that ever happened to the human race, but that it was the worst. You guys can make your own decisions as we come to the end of this presentation. So what are some of the serious consequences that come to mind? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, while calories are plentiful in the staple crops that we grow, like grains and tubers, these foods do tend to be poor in providing micronutrients, in particular things like iron and zinc, and they also tend to be very low in protein. This therefore can lead to malnutrition, especially in babies. Babies are getting sufficient calories at the time of the origins of agriculture, but studies show that they're actually suffering from malnutrition in terms of protein, in terms of iron deficiency, example of iron deficiency anemia in the skeleton, and nutritional stresses showing up in the growing teeth of young children. This is something that I did some work on at one point, and it's quite clear that if you compare hunter-gatherer populations to agricultural ones in the same area, every single time you look at them, the agricultural populations are less healthy. So why does this persist? Because it's good enough. Got enough calories, pumping out a lot of babies, people are shorter, people are less healthy, their bone growth is suboptimal, but they're surviving long enough to have more children. Furthermore, the food base that we talked about may not always be more predictable. It probably varies. In fact, famine as we know it probably did not appear as a true problem until we became reliant on just a few staple crops. What would a hunter-gatherer do if things got difficult? Move to a different area, rely on different foods. The average hunter-gatherer eats about 80 to 100 different foods. Whereas, while we might, in our society, eat quite a few, the staple crops are few and far between. Might be wheat, might be rice, might be manioc, but it's a very small number and one that are nutritionally inadequate. The picture that I got here is of the Irish potato famine, and that's because, again, it stresses the social inequalities. People were starving due to a potato blight. Millions died, but others still had access to sufficient resources. The line for this is that if people's crops failed, crops that made up about 90+% of their calories and diet, what were they going to do? where were they going to move? What would their fallback foods be? There simply weren't any. Finally, I want to point out that while agriculture allowed people to congregate in more permanent dwellings and live in larger and larger settlements, something that clearly allowed complex civilizations, art, and cultural aspects to flourish, it also came along with it some other congregations that weren't so desirable. In particular, these densely populated areas allowed infectious diseases to take hold and to spread. This is the site of Çatalhöyük in the Near East. And here is some skeletal data before and after the origins of agriculture, using measures in the skeleton to look at infectious disease prevalence. And while the scale is cut off here, sorry about that, you can see that after the origins of agriculture, those populations were suffering from far greater loads of infectious disease. So we might be wondering now, in the present, are we still evolving at all then with respect to our diet, or have all of our technological capabilities with agriculture really taken over from where the body left off? The answer is no. There's actually a lot of solid evidence that agriculture itself has even caused our bodies to evolve physically. And one example of this is that in recent years, probably we think in the last 3,000 to 4,000 years, individuals began to be able to digest milk into adulthood. Only about a third of the world's population can do this. But those that can are able to use this very valuable resource fully on into adulthood. The other 66% of the globe gets lactose intolerant and really shouldn't consume these foods. Likewise, we know that one of the enzymes, amylase enzyme, which is needed to digest starches, becomes greatly increased, especially in populations that are relying a lot on things like manioc and other starchy tubers. This is rice over here. The gene seems to have gotten duplicated over and over and over again, which is very adaptive for being able to process these foods. If we turn though to our own world today, I want us to begin to set all of what we've learned into context and think about what this means for us. So here in Ottawa right now, most, but I do want to stress by no means all of us, have access to an unprecedented amount and diversity of nutritious foods. We have these at all times of the year, and they come from all around the world. It's an amazing thing. Just look at Walmart's produce section demonstrated for you here. Likewise, our agricultural productivity continues to increase. We are better at managing land, we have great technological advances, and we can move these foods from place to place due to better transport systems. So this, sort of plenteousness seems like, wow, we've really got everything solved for ourselves right now. However, there's an unintended consequence with the bounty that comes with our food supply today. And that is that we actually have an overabundance of certain kinds of foods, in particular ones that are high in refined carbohydrates and added sugars. And when not properly controlled, as we'll see in a minute, these can lead to serious health consequences. In Canada and the US, as well as other parts of the Western Hemisphere as well, there's also an abundance of animal products. And again, remember, I'm not speaking of the whole world now, just our area. But this abundance of animal products can be really beneficial, of course, for children, because they need, as I mentioned, that meat, fat, and other things to grow and develop properly, especially their expensive brains. But in adults, it may not be healthy when consumed in excess amounts. People differ on what excess means with respect to meat, but there are some bad health consequences that have come to light that are associated with eating too much meat. So these patterns of dietary overconsumption that have come along with the bounty that we have available to us have actually led to some very serious chronic health problems. So think, our biology has been working well up until now, but our diet is now a little bit out of sync with it. We've actually come to epidemic proportions with respect to obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. Certain other cancers are also linked to the overconsumption of certain kinds of foods. Obesity and diabetes, I want to just stress for 1 second to mention that it does appear that the overconsumption of refined carbohydrates and added simple sugars may be at the root of these two particularly concerning epidemics. These are often called the diseases of Western civilization, which I just wanted to humble you by saying, and that's because traditional societies around the world, when they really adopt a diet that's a lot more like that in Western society, they tend to begin to suffer from these same diseases associated with the overconsumption or the malnutrition associated with emphasizing certain foods over others. However, the flip side of this story is that the story of Ottawa, or the Western Hemisphere that I just painted, is not true world over. In many places, there is serious food insecurity. And this comes, of course, with both undernutrition and malnutrition. This food insecurity is, of course, a result and highly linked to poverty, social conflicts, larger wars, crop failure, I'm going to come back to that, and disease. Disease can be in the human population or in the animal or crop populations that are trying to be raised through agriculture. I want to note to you that crop failure is often caused by climate change. And in today's world, this is a really key problem. It's estimated right now that about 100 million people in the world suffer from severe food insecurity, whereas about 1 in 8 globally, 1 in 8, suffer from some form of food insecurity, whether it be mild, moderate, or severe. The Lancet, a key medical journal, recently sort of saw this confluence of things that I've just described to you and coined a new term which you may not know, called the global syndemic. Sounds like a mouthful, but it basically recognized that there's 3 separate epidemics that are actually currently sort of intersecting and influencing each other in time and space. We just saw how obesity is a result of some of the dietary factors that are going on, how undernutrition is linked closely with food insecurity. And what I'm just going to show you is how these are both linked to climate change. Climate change has a huge impact on agriculture and food security because when climates change, crops tend to fail. Droughts and floods are on the rise, and these can influence crops. Other extreme weather events, such as a hurricane coming through, a tornado, maybe an early frost or a late frost that really changes the availability of a food that has now suffered terrible consequences. There are new and invasive pests. I mean, 2020 we might think of as the year of COVID-19, but it was also the year of the locust. And in parts of Africa and the Near East, locusts devastated crops. This is a picture from Kenya that was taken. And it's said that a swarm of locusts of this size, if landing on a field, can take it down to the ground in about 10 minutes flat, completely destroying individuals' livelihoods and their food security. I also want to just remind you that as climate changes, patterns of rainfall and temperature also change. And this means that foods that used to grow well or animals that used to do well in a particular area might no longer do so. And this causes huge food insecurity. So lest you think that this is only a problem of climate change, I do want to remind everybody that food insecurity in our present day is linked closely to infectious disease. COVID-19 is a horrible and very telling example of that. It's had a dramatic impact on supply chains and food availability for people in many parts of the world. Those who are relying on imported foods saw disruptions in transport of food, and therefore things just weren't available that had been available before. And other parts of the world where they're reliant on food aid, such as in this picture, they were left without adequate resources. Many organizations have been scrambling to resolve this now. And in fact, the World Food Program, which just won the Nobel Prize, wasn't my talk timely for that reason, that we've got the Nobel Prize being won for just this issue right now. But they've just actually estimated that about 130 million more people will suffer from acute food insecurity by the end of this year due to COVID-19. They're also rather proud of the fact that during the pandemic at several times, the World Food Program's airline was the one with the most flights at several different times. Now, lest we think that this food insecurity related to COVID is only a problem of the developing world, it couldn't be more farther from the truth. In the developed world, many have lost their jobs and hence their economic livelihoods and are therefore facing food insecurity. The amount of people relying here in Ottawa in North America and around the world on food banks and other assistance programs has really skyrocketed. Picture on the left is a picture of a lineup getting into the food bank in LA earlier this year. And then this spring in Chelsea, Massachusetts on the right, where people are lining up to try to get access to foods available at a food bank. These programs are simply not able to keep up with the demand right now. So whatever you might be thinking about agriculture at this point, its blessings, its curses, its problems, and its opportunities, the reality is that there's no going back. We're stuck with agriculture whether we love it or we hate it, or whether we're a little bit ambivalent about it. Because there's no way that 7 or 8 billion people can all turn around and become hunter-gatherers tomorrow. It's simply not possible with the amount of land there is on planet Earth. So what are we looking at with respect to the future? Lancet again has undertaken a question to ask just that question. How can we adequately feed a global population that might hit 10 billion by 2050? That's no small order. And how could we do that in a way that will actually improve our overall health? I hope I've demonstrated to you that in our current situation, in a number of manners, our health quality has actually gone down. We may be overnourished, we may be obese, we may suffer from diabetes, or we may be undernourished or malnourished. But how can we do this? Improve the diet, feed everyone, but do it in a way that's sustainable for the planet. Agriculture has probably had the biggest impact on the health of our planet of any particular activity that humans have ever undertaken. The Lancet created a team of 37 researchers from 16 different countries and took about 3 or 4 years to address just that question. And they came up with a series of solutions. One in which they created a diet called the Planetary Health Diet, and I'll tell you just a tiny bit about that. And another which looks at factors that we will have to control if we want to keep our bodies healthy with a healthy diet and our planet healthy by not exceeding the boundaries which will allow it to continue with the diversity and quality of life that we're used to. So first, what was the diet that they proposed, this planetary health diet? It's basically very high in plant foods. And especially fruits and vegetables. Very low in starchy vegetables, which ironically is part of our evolutionary history as you've seen in the past. Very, very low in animal foods. I would argue that this is probably the part of their diet that's the most controversial. And by animal foods, I don't just mean red meat either. Poultry, fish, eggs, dairy products, other things being very important in that category. An emphasis on plant proteins, and an emphasis on whole grains. That's the diet that they came up with, which they felt would reduce the number of deaths on this planet related directly to dietary causes, inadequacies, overabundances, overconsumptions, underconsumptions, malnutrition, by about 11 million people. The committee also basically undertook a pathways type project, and pathways, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, was something that we here at CACOR undertook to try to model, what if we do this in the future? Can we solve some of the environmental problems that we've created? And they did the same thing. And they said, what if we change the diet and start growing the foods that make up the planetary health diet? Will that help? And they big checkbox next to that, yes, indeed, it will help. What if we can improve food production dramatically? Improving cropland use, reducing greenhouse gases, using smart farming with robots and drones and sensors that can tell us when a crop needs to be watered, when it's overwatered, when there's a pest present, etc. If we can do all those things in a very sophisticated way, yes, that too will help. Likewise, if we can reduce food waste, and food waste is important, both on the production end, on the farm end, and on the consumption end. As you know, we waste a lot of food. The picture on the right is a farm field of a Floridian farmer who's growing tomatoes. This is during COVID this spring. He could find no one to pick his tomatoes and they all rotted on the vine. Just an example of the kind of food waste that can occur. We need to reduce our water usage for the health of our planet. And if they do that, that is a big increase. Fertilizer use needs to change. Some parts of the world need more fertilizers. in particular Africa and other parts of the developing world, their productivity would probably increase fivefold if they got better access to fertilizers. Whereas here in the Western world, we are over-fertilizing with polluting consequences for the environment. And finally, one of their goals was to not expand the agricultural land at all by 2050, but to keep it the same and just use it more efficiently. This will allow us to preserve existing natural ecosystems and lower extinction rates, which are on the rise. If we don't implement these things, the amount of biodiversity loss will be staggering. So they've actually come up with a series of things that can be done, and when all are done in concert, can actually allow us to see a future in 2050, which looks a whole lot better than if we just kept doing things the way that we are today. So there are challenges ahead. One major debate with this particular model, and I'm not saying that the EAT-Lancet model and their plan is the way to go ultimately, but one big question that arises out of this is how much meat we should be eating, and can we eat in order for the planet to survive in a healthy fashion moving forward. I think there's no doubt that we'd all agree that highly processed foods should probably be reduced. But certainly with respect to animal foods, children at the very least need high quality animal protein, as do pregnant women, and the elderly need about twice as much protein as a young adult would. In terms of the future and how we might get around some of these problems, we might ask ourselves whether technological innovations could solve at least some of our food security problems. Well, certainly artificial meat is one way that we're trying to avoid increasing greenhouse gases by creating meat without the cow and its burps and its manure and everything else. This has come to fruition, but only in a minor way. This hamburger here was created in the laboratory, but to a tune of close to $1 million probably when all was said and done. And where they're trying to scale this up now, it's not there yet, but it's promising. But on the right is another alternative. This is a plant-based burger. This is the famous Impossible Burger. It is artificial meat, quote unquote. It's made entirely of plant foods. It's even got a red, juicy, bloody inside there, which is the result of heme, which is added to it. Heme is iron. It's the same thing that makes burgers tasty, with the heme that comes from blood and muscle tissue. So the Impossible Burger may be another solution to getting things that seem like meat, but aren't exactly meat. Again, the irony of this is that our bodies are really designed to consume some meat. No question about that. However, how much meat we need to consume is a big question. Probably not that much is necessary, and we like a whole lot of it. How about eating more insects, everyone? Maybe people think that's gross, but I want to just share with you that around the world, many societies love insects. They eat lovely little kebabs that don't have chicken and souvlaki on them, but instead have juicy grubs of termites and other things on them, which they roast and consider to be delicacies. Even the president, Mr. President at Loblaws here, right in Ottawa, carries now cricket powder shown on the left. Cricket powder, I'm not sure exactly what one does with it, as I haven't bought it yet, but I think maybe you make a milkshake out of it. I've even seen a recipe where you can take your chicken cutlet and bread it in cricket flour rather than in breadcrumbs. Certainly insects are an excellent source of protein and fat, no question about that. Finally, maybe we can turn to something like aquaponics, which is a closed loop system whereby we grow fish for food in a cyclical system along with plants, which are also being grown for food. The fish provide fertilizer for the hydroponic system of the plants, and the plants clean the water and oxygenate it for the fish. So we get both our meat and our veggies at the same time. Now, as we look to the future, let's just set this back in context again of who we are as Homo sapiens and what we must bear in mind. The first thing is that the nutritional needs have shaped our bodies over the past 4 million years. And we have gone in certain directions with what we need to consume and what we want to consume. But no longer can we find ourselves in a situation where everyone on the planet is actually eating diets that support their biological health and well-being. Many are undernourished, many others are overnourished or just malnourished. They're eating the wrong things. Not only that, But we can no longer think only about ourselves as humans. We've actually modified the planet because of agriculture in very serious ways. So we need to consider the rest of that planet and every single other organism that's also trying to maintain its food security, since they share this planet with us. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was absolutely fabulous. And I just, as a moderator, I'm going to take a leaf from Art's book, and I get to ask the first question. I was really interested in your comments about worldwide and human evolution and modern stuff. And in the last while, I've become aware of a lot more people, at least it seems to me, a lot more people here in North America are developing or have food allergies. I was wondering if you can comment on whether or not that is an aspect of the Western society alone, or is food allergies on the increase in general around the world?
Interestingly, it does seem to be linked with Western society to a certain extent, and it's not just food allergies, but all kinds of allergies. It may have to do with the cleanliness of our environment on one hand. In other words, our environments are almost too clean for their own goods. It probably has a lot to do with our gut microbiomes, but things like celiac, which isn't exactly a food allergy, but an intolerance, is directly linked to the consumption of wheat, obviously, and the gluten that's in wheat. And we are unaware of the fact that these particular things were happening in the distant past. And it may have been partly because people who suffered from such allergies simply didn't live long enough to reproduce. But an interesting example of this related to food insecurity is that during World War II, they actually discovered celiac because grains were not available in places like Holland, for example. For a number of times, those people were very, very hungry. They were eating potatoes instead. That was still available. The individuals in that area, there was a group, most people were very, very hungry and not doing well at all. But there was a small group of individuals who had been suffering and were very thin, and all of a sudden they were doing better. And they became to understand that it was because they were not consuming wheat. Food allergies may be on a rise for a number of reasons having to do with our immune system as well, which is a larger question that we probably can't totally get into today. But there is no doubt that allergies to things like nuts are on the rise, and that this may have to do, again, with what's called the hygienic hypothesis, that our environments are so clean, we're not exposed to things that are potential pathogens, and therefore our immune systems overreact to both things in our environment as well as what we put in our bodies by the way of food. So ironically, with peanut allergies, they're now trying to give those who are potentially allergic little tiny bits of peanut early on, and this seems to prevent them from developing a severe allergy.
Excellent, thank you. The first question we've got, the first comment that was coming across was with Anitra. If you'd like to go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I think, thank you for a very excellent talk. It's very stimulating. I think when you look at the Western Hemisphere with what we have, our resources, that we have huge seas, and the Atlantic and the Pacific, the Arctic, and down in South America, the Antarctic, and these are extremely rich in protein as well as vegetable material. If you look at Asia, the average Asian eats 250 pounds per year of sea plant material, which has all the vitamins and minerals that you need. And second of all, they have massive, in almost all countries, massive mariculture, which is providing the economically challenged with a great deal of protein, especially for the children. If the children get a kilogram of protein per year in their first year, their brain development is much better, according to FAO. So I think one of the future things that all nations in the Western Hemisphere need to consider is how could we have a well-managed mariculture, and second of all, how we can preserve a lot of the marine areas so they're not so decimated, or restore them regeneratively, because both in Canada's British Columbia, as well as the Maritimes, as well as all over the coast of the United States, there are terribly degraded areas that could come back and be fish habitats and so forth. But the other point is, I think we should all say that the indigenous people here in the Americas were much more balanced with their protein and the things that you're talking about. And these food habits we have come from Europe, or our ancestors brought them over with them. And because we have so many resources, of course, they've become much more. Our member, Norman Borlaug of the USA Club of Rome, said that he was inventing the 4 times more fertile wheat to give the population a chance to catch up with the famine, and he hoped that someone would have a solution for famine as well as he had a solution for wheat and then rice. But this hasn't happened, unfortunately. So there are much less imaginative people working on population problems than are working on agriculture. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that this is great that you're emphasizing the marine resources. As I was emphasizing, probably the use of aquatic resources goes back really far in our evolutionary history. And you're absolutely right that this is going to be a way in which we can perhaps do things a lot better. In fact, I didn't mention that aspect of the EAT-Lancet diet, but they're a big fan of aquatic resources too. Although, as you pointed out, not degrading aquatic areas by fish farms, for example, is a critical way, like doing it responsibly and sustainably will be key. But there's even been studies that have shown that babies and small children that consume fish, as opposed to any other kind of animal protein, actually grow the biggest and healthiest brains. So you're spot on with that point for sure. And with respect to indigenous agriculture, the 3 sisters of corn, beans, and squash that made up their agricultural base in much of the New World is a wonderfully balanced protein. Between the beans and the squash and the corn, they balance each other out in terms of the amino acids that are present. And this is a way, again, of using plants to get protein sources and not relying only on animals to do that. Jean, I'll turn it over to you for the next question.
Okay, the next person online is John Meyer.
Yeah, I certainly, I think the quality of your presentation is sort of shown. I could ask 50 questions here, but I so far have restricted myself to 2. Anyway, the first, when I look at climate, I typically look 300,000 or 400,000 years back, and you have massive volatility. It's it's different from your perspective of 5 or 6 million years ago. The last 400,000 or 500,000 years has been incredible volatility, generally colder, until the last 12,000 years, where temperatures increase and we get this spooky flatness in the consistency of climate. And I've always thought that in the period of the last 200,000 years, where we were effectively intellectually about the same level, I don't think there's a big trick to figuring out planting and growing things. I think a number of species have done it. And have you looked at or run across any research that looks into the possibility of agriculture having been practiced prior to 12,000 years ago, when it really did take off? I would have thought it was popping up earlier. It was just getting wiped out by climate change and people having to move.
And I think you're probably right. There's no good archaeological evidence that we can find of resources being systematically domesticated before that, although there's a lot of question about whether certain animals were domesticated well before the end of the last ice age, or 10 to 12,000 years ago. In particular, the dog, there's some question about how early it might have been domesticated. And I think you're right that there's no sort of magic sort of time period that we should put on, but probably experiments, like you said, were wiped out time and time again. One of the things you have to remember about the Ice Age is that there were periods of warmth where maybe agriculture would have been successful, but the fluctuations, like you said, there were cycles of lots of different orders of amplitude and time, and that this may have simply made it not feasible to rely on the fact that if you planted something, it would successfully grow, because things were much more, as we say, inequitable, not equitable, equable. They were not equitable. Climates were bouncing all over the place. So the archaeological record just isn't good enough for us to be able to ascertain. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if we see some evidence for it once the archaeological record reveals some of those things. But the farther back in time you go, the less, especially the crop kind of resources preserve. They just don't preserve well. We end up with bones. And the bones of the animals that we find in these sites during the Ice Age do not show signs of domestication, which are very clear when we do get after the end of the Ice Age. Not to say that they weren't doing some pretty sophisticated ways of hunting and gathering that may have been initial forays into tending crops and tending animals. Think of caribou, for example.
Yep. Okay, good. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine and John. Good questions. Next, we have Jeff Passmore.
Thank you, Catherine. I've heard it said that we don't have a global foods shortage. There's simply a refrigeration and transportation problem. Could you comment?
That's probably true. There does seem to be, if you look at it in terms of calories, available crop lands and available foods to be grown, that there's probably enough to feed all of the mouths on this planet. But as I mentioned with the small example that I gave of Africa, where they don't have access to fertilizers, it is true that certain areas are not as productive in using that arable land. So we're not getting as much bang for our buck in those cases. Distribution networks are also a huge issue. You mentioned refrigeration, for example. Many parts of the world don't have effective refrigeration. And yes, the more that we can distribute things more evenly across the planet, the better off everyone will be. Not all lands are potentially arable as well, but we have tended to dominate our agricultural lands with certain crops. If we can diversify more, as the Planet Diet suggests, that might also be part of the answer to the problem. We tend to have monocultural crops, especially here in North America, but in other places too. Vast swaths of one particular crop, much of it isn't for food. So if we can change or redress the balance of how much of the food land for growing food that's available is used for growing things that are actually going to be consumed by humans versus things that are going to be used in industry or, for example, as feedstock in particular. Every time you go up one level on the trophic scale, you lose about 90% of what there is to eat. And that's one of the arguments against too much meat eating. So I think there's, the EAT-Lancet Commission thinks that we have enough land to actually feed 10 billion by 2050, but we've just got to do it a lot smarter.
Well, and part of that smarter would be electrification and transportation. We can't just look. I mean, the point of my question is we can't just be looking at agriculture in isolation. We need to be looking at how do we provide electricity and refrigeration to these areas that don't have it.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. And I really was focusing more on the biological dietary aspects of it today, but you're completely right that it's a huge question and a very critical one. Agricultural production systems, apart from what animals produce, are really major greenhouse gas emitters. And that needs to change.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Dave had a question that he asked me to question. It's a good lead on from what Jeff had asked. It's about if we can't feed everybody now, how can we get to 10 billion people? And I was thinking when I was listening to your response to Jeff was, when was that 10 billion people number actually calculated, and has that actually been looked at again since all of the things about climate change coming as quickly as, more quickly now than we thought it was going to, has that been taken into account in that number?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I feel like the numbers are bandied about rather loosely. The commission was formed about 5 years ago, the EAT-Lancet Commission, and the numbers that they were using were predictions from then. And I've seen different predictions for what population will look like. Some say that in certain areas it is going to go down rather than up. But so no, I don't think we have a good handle in all respects. Certain populations are doubling still at a very rapid rate, whereas other ones aren't. And I think it's ironic that populations are growing fastest in areas where they actually have a great deal of food insecurity. This is because you can have just enough calories to actually grow and reproduce often. And this is what is tending to happen in places, especially in the developing world. And sometimes moderate amounts of food security will lead to some periods of food stress. And then the rebound is that these individuals actually end up over-consuming the kinds of foods we talked about and becoming less healthy, but actually maybe even suffering from some levels of obesity. Mm-hmm. So isn't that ironic? No, I don't think the predictions are solid at all, Jean and Dave, but they're a working sort of trajectory that we can think about. And that's all I really have to say about that, because I'm certainly not a population expert. And one of the things that's tricky too is in the past, trying to reconstruct, how many people were around at the end of the Ice Age. That's extremely difficult to do too. You'll notice I said between 1 and 5 million. Like, so you'll hear it all, different. It's very, very difficult to look at that question in the past as well as in the future.
Okay, thanks. Next question is John Lake.
Thanks, Jean. And there is an expression in French, Catherine, which tries to summarize your presentation, and it's a tour de force. That is to say, and a poor translation into English, wide-ranging and profound.
Well, merci beaucoup.
Anyway, so my question has to do with the issue of population. That is to say, and this is an old issue, and you must have been asked this question many times. So with your depth and range, I'd be interested in your comments, and that is, do you think there's any hope in the goal of a fellow organization in Ottawa called PIC, Population Institute of Canada? And I mentioned something in the future which we may, I say we, because I haven't yet put the proposition to Art Hunter, but this is John Holland's idea, and you may have heard of the president of Population Institute of Canada, Madeleine Weld. I have loaned her the book written by, and I'm afraid I forget his first name, he writes for the Globe and Mail, Ibbotson, and the title of the book is Empty Planet. Well, he is a dreamer, in my view, because I'm on the other side. That is to say, get the population under control. It has quadrupled in the 100 years, and then another billion added from 2000 to 2007, and we're adding 80 million a year. So the question to you is, how do you see the future success, which of course would be a complete change from the past, the future success of Population Institute of Canada, and for that matter, CACOR, which believes in an excess of growth in all regards, to get the population under control? Is there any hope there? If we don't, it will be taken care of by the world itself, seems to me. Your comments, please.
Well, certainly, you know, what you've seen in many Western countries where there's basically zero population growth and in some cases a decline in population, if the access to birth control is available and if people are willing, and that's partly a cultural phenomenon as well as one where they're thinking about the environment and the planet, there are cases which have shown us that it is possible to not only curtail population, but to even reduce it. The flip side of that is that such measures are unequally available and sometimes poorly received culturally in certain parts of the world. And so I think it will behoove us to find ways in which we can bring messages of the dangers of population growth, of having too many offspring. You know, they've often said that if you educate women in some of these developing countries, that they will choose paths that actually curtail the number of offspring that they have. And once they have more education and more access to different alternatives and can see their futures differently. How do I feel about what our prospects are for the future? That's a really good question, John, and I'm not sure that I can totally answer that. You know, I don't think we're there yet, but I think that what we've seen in the societies that have limited it, but not limited in a way that China did, which I think was, although well-meaning, ultimately a demographic disaster. Because between China and India, there are going to be roughly 50 million excess men without access to partners, to women, to either have relationships with or to have children with in the future. And this is now becoming a huge problem. So the one-child policy where everybody wanted a boy there certainly wasn't the solution. But birth control itself, access to that, and really access to education fundamentally in a way that we can apply in a culturally sensitive way, in a religiously sensitive way, are probably our best hopes. But I'm not, again, as somebody who works on paleo diet, I can't say that I'm an expert on the future areas of population growth and curtailment, but those would be some of my thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Catherine,
Oh.
sorry, I just wanted to say to Catherine's response, it's Jeff, that I completely agree about education, but it's also about healthcare. Because if you know that 50% of your children are going to die by the age of 3, you're going to have a lot more children than if you know they're all going to live to adulthood. So it's also a huge amount of healthcare involved.
Yes, and in many traditional societies that are relying on less sophisticated agricultural techniques, more children equals more hands to tend to crops, to harvest crops. And so that sort of feeds in, literally and figuratively, feeds in is the right word to use, on itself.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. The next up is Ted Manning.
Yeah, there's been so much interesting stuff thrown onto the table now, it's difficult to respond to any one because it's a difficult systematic problem. In fact, probably the most difficult systematic problem we have. And there are germs of good news coming out of countries which are diminishing the number of children born. And there are some places where diets are being made more efficient. But again, all of the above need to be applied. You know, better technology, better education. There are enough feedbacks now in most of the continents where people are having fewer children, where they are doing their best to feed them efficiently. Now, how do we define efficiently? Well, that is really the challenge. It is astounding how much food goes from one place to another. I mean, and my daughter's going to address that in more detail at the end of the month on essentially procurement and transport. But I never cease to be astounded when I go to the shop and I can get blueberries from Peru for $2 a box. You know, the fact is that the technology very likely exists. The transportation systems do. But as the World Food Program will tell you, a very significant percentage of the food which is produced never makes it to use. It is either rots in place, it is dies in the way of transport, it sits on the dock because somebody wasn't bribed enough to take it inland, and ultimately is thrown away because it comes in the wrong kinds of packaging. Or you can only, when I go to Costco, I have to buy a 45-gallon drum of something I need 3 ounces of. You know, quite frankly, the difficulty comes back to not taking a holistic systems approach. That is why I think it's a very important issue for our organization to take on directly, because there's certainly enough gray cells on the screen in front of me where if we put them all together, we might be able to come up with some solutions. But as I said, that there's no one answer. And that is why a systematic and holistic approach to it needs to be taken. And we need to know that it's not just what's happening in Ottawa, it's also happening in Africa. And Africa is the biggie right now for population, for food, and all of the above. The other continents are an awful lot closer to food security. So maybe we have 2 quite different problems. Anyway, that's my very broad sweep.
Thank you. I don't think that needed any response because that's all very spot on, and I completely agree.
Yeah.
With that, our next question is coming from Alison Hobb.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Catherine. That was such an impressive talk.
Yeah.
My question is a little bit political. How confident are you that the vested interests of the big agriculture companies, and by that I would include the big fishing companies and the big companies selling pesticides, will allow us to make these changes necessary for a healthy and sustainable future?
That's a really good question. You know, and it is going to involve getting them on board to see what the real benefits of making the switches are. And some of the most difficult ones are going to be the heavy emphasis on things like corn agriculture here in the States and Canada and things like that. Those areas where a huge amount of the land is being used for that, and there's a lot of money in it. I think that it's going to be difficult, but I think we're seeing tiny little inroads, Allison, such that things like what's happened with Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, the fact that Beyond Meat entered the stock market on this highest level ever seen and sort of thing, that if individuals in these big agro businesses can see the dollars, perhaps that's one way in which we can get them on board by seeing the benefits that way. It would be too bad if that were the only reason that they wanted to be doing the right thing, quote unquote, for the planet. But I think if there can be models out there that can show them, you can make as much money or you can do as much with this particular, let's say, unit of arable land as you did before, then I think we can get some of these companies on board. But honestly, I don't know. Right now, money drives a lot, and I'd really like to see a world where it wasn't really about money anymore, but about the well-being of the planet, the well-being of people, and other things like that.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you.
Thank you again. Next, we have Barry Bruce.
Hi. There we go. I'm a family doctor, and I'm wondering about the comment about no starchy foods, or not an emphasis on starchy foods. I'm thinking that they are very efficient in terms of providing calories and vitamins. And when combined with other proteins, that are plant proteins, that are high in plants that are high in protein, like beans and legumes, that could be a complete diet. You've already mentioned Three Sisters as being a wonderfully complete, balanced diet. So can you comment on just the absence of starchy foods?
Yeah, this is something that the EAT-Lancet Healthy Planet Diet came up with. And I was a little mystified by that particular category of it as well. It seemed to me that I don't think starchy foods in the way we might be envisioning it are actually really at the root of the problem. I think they were getting at the, let's avoid foods that break down simply into glucose, because excess simple carbohydrates seem to be part of the problem with obesity and type 2 diabetes. So I think that was where they were coming from when they did that. And yet many populations subsist on a starchy root vegetable, like in parts of Africa where they're relying particularly heavily on manioc. Obviously, lots of people lived a lot on potatoes for a long time in certain places too. So I'm not sure I totally agree with their starchy food category in that. Do you guys want me to put back up that particular chart again, or is that not necessary? But it basically does show that there's very little by way of, here, let me just put it up again and we can look at that graph. Very, very little by way of, I think I can get to it pretty quickly. There. Very little in the way of starchy vegetables. You know, the picture behind there was corn, actually, not something like a root crop. So I think that may be telling, because corn in and of itself is not, it is, again, as you mentioned, a very good source of calories. And for many people, they need that. But I think it's probably an overemphasis on other food categories, and starchy vegetables could be okay, depending on what starchy vegetable. And your question actually makes me, I'm going to unscreen share now. Your question actually makes me want to comment really briefly on the fact that one of the other criticisms of this EAT-Lancet diet, apart from what you just raised about starchy vegetables and that I told you about the meat, that some people are really upset about the very low level of animal products in the diet, is that many have said that it's not culturally sensitive enough to what the food base is in different parts of the world now and what things people are relying on. They tried to argue that it was, and that it could be modified in a lot of different ways, but I think the jury's still out on that. Personally, I don't think this exact diet is going to be what's going to be adopted, but I was, pretty struck, obviously, when this Healthy Planet diet came out, with how similar the diagram looks to the new Canada's food guide that came out last year.
Thank you.
Jean, you're muted. Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have been trying to get Mary Hagan to ask her question, but she hasn't been responding. So I will ask the question that she put through on the chat line. She says, most interesting to understand food. Where are we here? It keeps bouncing. Most interesting to understand foods on the physical body and changes and physical health. For humans, does food production and consumption not have an equal effects of social and emotional health on behavior, social identity, culture, and mental well-being? I see.
Yes to all of those things, Mary, absolutely. I had to limit my talk, and I very consciously took this perspective of, let's look at our evolutionary history and set some of the problems in the context of our past and our biological characteristics. But absolutely every single one of those is relevant and would be the subject and the fodder for many more CACOR speeches and talks.
Okay, thank you. There are quite a few people who had already asked questions who continued on with the chat function. And at this stage, instead of moderating that, there are, I would ask that people like John Meyer, who made some interesting comments, as well as Anitra, if she's still around, talking about some of the archaeological issues. If they want to open up their mics and we can have a bit more of a rounded discussion.
I was just going to do rapid fire for Catherine. Catherine, okay, quick and
Yes.
dirty question. How many hectares of farmland in Canada does it take to supply a Canadian with good diet?
No clue.
Good.
No, I can't
Okay.
answer that question.
Good answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ask me a more archaeological one. We'll be on safer ground.
5,000 years ago, how many acres?
Yeah, right. Oh,
My question was that one of your Canadian workers in British Columbia named Howley has shown that various countries have decimated a lot of the North Pacific food webs, particularly China, Korea, and Japan, which go out with these very, very big factory ships and take everything that's there, including the mammals, the dolphins and the turtles and so forth. And then they, whatever they can't make into human food, they make into dog food and all kinds of other protein. But this is setting back millions and hundreds of millions of years, the oceanic food chain. And there's got to be something done about this gross destruction by a few nations, namely Portugal, Spain, Russia, China, Japan, Korea, who are out there absolutely plundering the 75% of the Earth's surface, which is the ocean. And unless we do that, the food which would be potentially available is going to be ruined in a couple generations, which took hundreds of millions of years to evolve. So that has to be part of the world's food problem.
absolutely. You also mentioned pet food, which is a huge issue, eh? We have so many pets today that are relying on different kinds of foods and what we're feeding them. Some organizations are really thinking that that needs to change in terms of ways that can make it more sustainable, because you know, we simply can't be growing a lot of meat to feed to our pets. The planet can't support that either.
No.
I'd like to interject at this point because I'm sorry, Art, I missed him on the list. I was getting things coming down, but Art does have a question.
Yeah, Catherine, I'd like to get back to some of your earlier slides, which were addressing the necessity for meat protein, particularly in the young. But there is, I think we all know people who are vegetarians and vegans, and in today's world, are either of those recommended diets, and why not?
I think that the answer to that question is not if you're a young child. Particularly, remember, every single one of us, our very first food was milk. And that is a human mammalian necessity. And you can't survive and grow your healthy brain without that at the beginning of your life. Most of human brain growth has actually finished by the time you're about 7 years of age. That's actually way longer than most species. But at least in those critical early years, my argument would be that you absolutely need to have some high quality animal protein. Can we today modify proteins and fats so that we can mimic that by vegetarian or vegan sources? Yes, we probably can. But no baby is a vegetarian or vegan, at least, because we're all raised on mother's milk. So a couple horrible natural experiments occurred where vegan parents weaned their children onto a totally vegan diet. This happened in the Netherlands and in Germany, to the really detrimental consequences of the brain growth of their young children. That was after they were weaned. I also want to point out that all humans are dependent on vitamin B12, which is extremely difficult to get from only plant-based foods. So that most vegans and many vegetarians should be supplementing with vitamin B12. This suggests a necessity for at least a small amount of meat. But the answer is, as an adult, for most people, you can cut way back compared to what we're consuming now. With a vitamin B12 supplement, you can probably be perfectly healthy. Now, Dr. Bruce probably knows more about this than I do, but from my evolutionary perspective, my take on it is our biology is telling us that we do need to consume some meat but it's a very, very tiny amount.
Thank you.
With that, we are coming up to almost an hour and a half of this unbelievably great presentation. Catherine, thank you so much. Excellent questions, wonderful presentation. So I would ask Art if he would be able to turn the recording off at this point.
I guess there's only one person that's left over, and that was Susan Tanner.
I couldn't find her on the list.
Oh.
So, and hers was more of a,
I guess
Yeah.
I think she's gone. I think I saw her leave, yeah.
Excuse me, this is Lynn Bond. I've been trying to send a chat and it won't go through. I don't know why.
Oh,
I'm sorry,
you have to hit return and then it'll go.
Return. Which one?
if you have a question, go ahead.
Yeah, well, the question is, I'm a child of people who were farmed through the 30s, the dirty 30s. And the respect for food and the ability to preserve it and use every scrap of it was so prominent. And so many industries are suffering with the pandemic and things are changing so much. Maybe it's time we all learned how to preserve, keep things. We had no refrigeration. I had no electricity as a child. I don't presume that we'll ever get rid of electricity. But on the other hand, maybe we should go back to some of these less energy consuming practices. Our fridge was the winter. If we had to preserve, keep something cold, we froze it in the winter and prayed that we didn't have a Bonspiel thaw. But anyway, there are ways around this, and you gain a greater respect for your food and who's going to consume it and how it's going to be consumed and saved. And maybe we should start promoting some of these practices.
Thank you. That's a really good point. We have kind of in our big agro business, some of the things that were mentioned by other people, we have gotten away from many of those things, and the closeness of our own lives to the food that we consume. When it's almost too easy to go to the grocery store and just see everything there. We don't think as much about where it came from and what it took to get it there. We tend to throw things away too. Food waste is a huge problem in our society as well. So not just preserving what comes in, but using, like you said, every scrap of what's there, I think is a really, really important thing. And one of the things that a lot of organizations are working on, and I think will be very important in the future. And that is, we've got to find ways to reduce food waste. Even think about how much you throw out. It really bothers me, and I try to be really good about not throwing out things, but the estimates that they've come up with in our society here in Canada is that something upwards of 40% of food gets wasted, like it gets thrown out. I don't think I'm that bad, but people have actually weighed stuff, and it's kind of scary what they've come up with in that respect. So yes, I completely agree with your take on that, Lynn. I think a better appreciation for how we can make the most out of what we have will be critical.
Catherine, how many people know what's in the bottom of their freezer? When was the last time you looked?
How about in the back third of every shelf on your fridge too, right?
Okay.
Where the broccoli goes to die.
That's what I meant about respect.
I'm going to turn the recording off now, and I would like to just formally thank you, Catherine. I thought that was a fabulous presentation. Your artwork was just excellent. We'll make sure that this gets put on our website.